Hello everyone! Welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, your favorite niche podcast about jewelry history where for some reason Napoleon Bonaparte comes up way too often. It's been a little while since I released the last podcast episode in December. I wanted to take a little break, come back refreshed, rejuvenated, rested, and I am back. I'm also none of those things because the world is in a weird place right now, but I'm sure you're probably feeling the same way. Whether you live in the United States like I do, or you are somewhere else in this big wide world, things are strange. But we can put all that aside because today we're going to be learning about one of the topics that makes all of the jewelry nerds go crazy, the history of the House of Fabergé. Even if you don't know anything about the history of Fabergé, if you've been alive on this planet for any length of time, you are probably familiar with Fabergé eggs, whether through pop culture or because you have always dreamt of having your own jewel-encrusted Easter egg. Fabergé eggs have really infiltrated the collective consciousness. But before we get into the good stuff, a little bit of housekeeping. This series on the history of Fabergé represents the return of Deep Dive Wednesdays, where I choose one topic and go a little further down the rabbit hole with 2 longer episodes on Wednesdays. That's right, I'm back to posting on Wednesdays. If a series warrants it, there will be 3 episodes per month, but usually I'm aiming for 1 every 2 weeks. The history of the House of Fabergé is going to be the first deep dive for 2025. Oh, and I suppose I should introduce myself. If you don't already know what this project is about and who I am, my name is Melise. I am a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques, and I have a video series, also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, where we approach history through the lens of jewelry. Because jewelry is, of course, one of the most important and intimate forms of art that humans create. It is also one of the oldest. You can find me on most social media platforms, that's Instagram, TikTok, although who knows how long that'll stick around in the US, and YouTube, under the username moonhoney.jewelry. I try to release videos 3 to 5 times a week, and although the name of the series is Ancient History Jewelry Stories, it has broadened to encompass just about every era of human history. For those of you who have joined me on Patreon, first off, huge thanks. I really appreciate your support, and you may have noticed that things are a little quiet over there. I'm trying to figure out exactly how I can give you all something of value for being a Patreon member, both paid and unpaid. Last year, I didn't really hit a good balance between Patreon content and regular content, but I am brainstorming to figure out exactly what it is that you might want from me to entice you to be a member of my Patreon. As always, I do not take requests, but if you are a paid Patreon member, you do get to vote in polls. I put them up every once in a while to determine the topic of videos and podcasts. We had a few last year, and there are going to be more of them this year. So if you want to have any kind of say in the content that I make, please join me on Patreon at patreon.com/Ancient History Jewelry Stories and sign up for the $5 a month tier. If you are a Patreon member or you've been thinking about becoming one and you have some ideas about what you might like as an incentive to be a part of the Patreon group, you can send me an email at hello@shopmoonhoney.com. I welcome all of your suggestions as long as they are reasonable. And one last thing before we get into the good stuff, I've had a lot of people on TikTok send me messages about whether or not I plan to join other social media sites because of the impending TikTok ban in the United States. First of all, I'm pretty sure we're all still going to be able to access TikTok. They're not going to be able to just take it off of our phones. You won't be able to download updated versions of the app in the App Store or the Play Store. Unless you know how to use a VPN, now is a good time to learn. So I don't plan on jumping the TikTok ship. I am not joining Blue Sky. I'm not joining Threads. Those of you who are on TikTok and want to find my video content somewhere else, my major following is on Instagram, and you can always find me on YouTube as well. I have the same username on all 3 platforms, moonhoney.jewelry. Now, with all of that boring stuff out of the way, let's get into the history of the House of Fabergé. The initial House of Fabergé was founded in 1842 in St. Petersburg, Russia, by Gustave Fabergé. And if that name doesn't sound very Russian to you, well, you are correct. It does have its roots in France, although Gustave Fabergé himself was born in what is now known as Germany. The name can be traced all the way back to the 17th century in France. The name started out as Favre with an I and eventually evolved to become Fabergé with a fancy little accent. The original Favre family fled France as part of the Huguenots, the French Protestants, who fled France sometime after 1685 in order to escape religious prosecution. As they moved farther east, the name evolved. From Favre with an I, it became Favre with a Y, then Fabry, then Fabrier, then Fabergés, then Fabergé with no accent. I'm honestly not very sure if it would have even been pronounced Fabergé without the accent. Perhaps it was just Faberge. Somebody who speaks French can probably enlighten me on this topic. By the second half of the 18th century, we know that there was a Jean Favre in Berlin, and then by 1800 in Estonia, we find a Pierre Favre with a Y. In 1814, there is record of the birth of Gustave Fabrier. This Gustave Fabrier and Gustave Fabergé, founder of the House of Fabergé, seem to be one and the same. By the year 1825, it's documented that the family name had evolved to Fabergé or Faberge, the one without the accent. Sometime in the 1830s, Gustave moved from Estonia to St. Petersburg, where he began training under the goldsmith Andreas Ferdinand Spiegel. Now, Spiegel had a specialty which was very specific. He specialized in making gold boxes. This is, unfortunately, a job that I think doesn't really exist anymore. There doesn't seem to be a huge market for small gold boxes these days. I can surmise that at the time when Gustave was working with Spiegel, these little gold boxes were probably mostly snuff boxes. And if you don't know what snuff is, people used to love snorting powdered tobacco, which is about as disgusting a habit as you can imagine. And the wealthy would keep their snuff in these elaborate, often bejeweled or enameled little gold boxes. After completing his apprenticeship with Spiegel, Gustave went on to work with Keibel, who were the goldsmiths and jewelers to the emperors. After finishing that apprenticeship, he finally earned the title of Master Goldsmith in 1841. And it seems that he wasted absolutely no time because in 1842, he opened his first shop, the House of Fabergé, and this is when he added the accent to the name. This was in an attempt to appeal to the Russian Francophilia. The Russian court was simply obsessed with France, and anything from France carried an air of luxury. France was very much associated with luxury goods in Russia at the time, and in fact, French was the official language of the royal court of Russia. That tiny little accent at the end of the name was a marketing masterstroke on Gustave's part. It seems that 1842 was a very busy year in Gustave's life, because not only did he open his first shop, but he also got married. His wife was a woman named Charlotte Jungsted. She was the daughter of an artist of Danish descent. Just a few years later, in 1846, Gustave and Charlotte welcomed their first child, a son whom they named Peter Karl, although he is more often referred to as just Karl. This is the member of the Fabergé family that most people are familiar with. In fact, if you only know a bit about the House of Fabergé, you've probably been scratching your head and wondering who the hell this Gustave guy is. Peter Karl Fabergé is the one who really brought the House of Fabergé to prominence. He's the one who had all of the creative and bright ideas. He's the one who created the Fabergé egg, and he is the one who is responsible for the long-standing relationship with the Russian royal court. He is not the only son of Gustave and Charlotte. They had another son a whole 16 years later who did go on to join the family business, and that son had a much cooler name. Their second son was named Agathon, which I think is just absolutely fantastic. And I am jumping ahead a little bit here, but I do want to retract something I said. Karl was not the only one who had the bright ideas. Apparently, when Agathon joined the House of Fabergé, he brought along with him a lot of innovation. He is also responsible for the prominence of the House of Fabergé. From what we know about Peter Karl's early life, we can guess that Gustav's business was doing pretty well. Karl was educated at a school known as the Gymnasium of St. Anne's, which was a school for students of the affluent middle class and of the lower nobility. This says that he was already hobnobbing it with people of means and wealth, probably because his father's jewelry business was bringing in a significant amount of money. In 1860, Gustav Fabergé decided to retire to Dresden and left the House of Fabergé in the capable hands of business partners. It's a bit unclear to me exactly how much day-to-day involvement Gustav would have had in the running of the business, if any at all, at this point, but the fact that he's referred to as being retired makes me think that he was probably pretty hands-off. So at this point, the business was not being run by any member of the Fabergé family, but was instead being run by capable managers. It seems that Gustav did not move alone. He probably took his wife Charlotte and also Peter Karl, because at some point, Peter Karl attended business school in Dresden. After finishing this, he was sent to England, both in order to learn English and to start his grand tour. For those unfamiliar with the phrase, the grand tour, this was a custom that was popular from the 17th through 19th centuries, in which upper-class men, often from the nobility, would travel through Europe with Italy as their principal destination. They often did this in the company of a tutor or chaperone, and often when they came of age, around 21 years old. The purpose of this grand tour was to continue education and enrich the lives of these young men by exposing them to culture and art throughout Europe. It would often take a few years, and many would end in Italy. This was a huge rite of passage for many of these young men, and it was definitely tied to the obsession with classicism that existed throughout Europe at this time. Eventually, wealthy young men from North and South America would also embark on this grand tour, and, to everyone's surprise, at some point, they let women do it too. While embarking on his grand tour, young Peter Karl apprenticed with goldsmiths in Frankfurt, France, and England, furthering his education. It seems that young Peter Karl went on his grand tour at a younger age than many men of his station, because when he returned to St. Petersburg in 1864 in order to join the family business, he was only 18 years old. Of course, at this age, he was not old enough to take over the family business, so instead he was tutored by the manager of the Fabergé firm until 1872, when he was finally ready to take over. At this point, he would have been 24 years old. This stretch of time between Peter Karl moving back to St. Petersburg and taking over the family firm is a very important and formative time in his life. While he was coming of age and probably learning the ins and outs of how to run the business, he was also doing something else, something that makes him truly endearing to me, something that cements him as a massive ancient jewelry nerd, something that allowed him to go on and impress the Tsar of Russia and become one of the most famous jewelers, considered the king of goldsmiths. That is, taking on unpaid work at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It's hard to say exactly when Peter Karl would have developed a fascination with ancient jewelry, but I think it's safe to guess that it would have been on his grand tour. Because, of course, while traveling through Europe, he would have been exposed to art. He would have been exposed to modern art, but of course, at the same time, would have been exposed to a whole lot of ancient and classical art. While classicism did not have as much of a chokehold on Europe at the time when he went on his grand tour, it was still relevant, and there was still a lot of looking back at the ancient masters in order to inform oneself of what was important in the field of art. A lot of idolizing of pure white marble statues. You know the drill. The kind of thing that we still think of today when we think of the classical world, although we now know that a lot of those statues would have been covered in gaudy polychrome paint, the sort of thing that would have given Michelangelo conniptions. It's pretty safe to say that Peter Carl was probably looking at a good number of ancient Italian finds from the Greeks, the Romans, and the Etruscans. Beautiful gold jewels, impeccably worked, using techniques that were considered all but lost at his time. So it makes perfect sense that when he came back to St. Petersburg and he had a little time on his hands as the son of a wealthy man with a business that was being run by capable managers, he set out to do something that brought him some joy, something where he could continue his goldsmithing education in a way that made him happy, and that was being essentially an unpaid intern at the Hermitage Museum. The fact that they entrusted him with the sort of work that he ended up doing is unbelievably fascinating to me. Here comes this 18, maybe 19-year-old guy. He's had some goldsmithing experience. Sure, he went on his grand tour. Sure, he's the son of a master goldsmith, but he would have had only a few years' worth of experience, and yet the Hermitage felt comfortable, not only allowing him to handle ancient gold finds, but to restore many of the pieces in their collections as well. The Hermitage already had a fairly sizable collection of important ancient Scythian gold jewels, many of these from the time of Peter the Great in the early 18th century. They came from, shall we say, the looting of ancient Scythian burial mounds. But there were many significant finds being made during Peter Carl's lifetime as well. So he would have been hearing news of these new discoveries, glittering, intricate ancient Scythian works of art, many of which were making their way to the Hermitage at the time when he was doing his unpaid work. During the 19th century, the Hermitage not only restored quite a few pieces in their collection, but they also made copies of some of the more fragile or more intricate pieces. And while there isn't very much attribution and we don't know exactly which pieces he would have handled, I think it's safe to say that a few of these, if not quite a few of these, probably would have been worked on by Peter Carl himself. This access to and intimate knowledge of these ancient Scythian works continued to foster his fascination with ancient gold jewels. It seems that it also allowed him to continue his goldsmithing education because he was awarded the title of Master Goldsmith in 1882, which is 10 whole years after taking over the family firm. It is a bit unclear exactly how long he continued to work for the Hermitage. It's stated that he started in 1867, but I don't see a definite end date. But if I know anything about ancient history nerds, he probably stayed on for as long as he possibly could, despite not getting a paycheck. And I don't blame him. If someone told me that I can come and touch, look at, deconstruct, reconstruct all of the ancient jewelry that I wanted to, I wouldn't want a penny. I would ask if I can pay them for the privilege. And it seems that all of this unpaid work was going to pay off in a huge way for Peter Carl. The real pivotal moment in Peter Carl's career came in 1882, the same year that he got the title of Master Goldsmith. During this year, he and his younger brother, Agathon, who at that point was only 20 years old, exhibited at the Pan-Russian Exhibition of Industry and the Arts in Moscow. Because Peter Carl had been working with ancient Greek and ancient Scythian jewelry at the Hermitage, he had also been given permission to copy and incorporate these motifs into his jewelry collection. This led to him making pieces that were not only inspired by the ancient Scythian jewels, but outright copies. If you listened to my podcast episodes about archaeological revival, then you will remember that this was a time when the Western world was deep in the throes of the archaeological revival trend. This wasn't the first time that there had been an archaeological revival trend, but this was probably the most important and the most influential time that archaeological styles influenced jewelry in Europe and the United States. It was at this Pan-Russian exhibition that the Emperor Alexander III came by and had a look at Peter Carl's exquisite works of art. He was particularly smitten with one of his copies of an ancient Scythian double-headed lion bracelet. He was so impressed by the craftsmanship that he proclaimed that he could not tell the difference between the original and the one made by Peter Carl. This bracelet and the emperor's reaction to it, this is the holy shit moment. This is the exact moment when the Fabergé egg was first conceived, if you want to think of it that way. This is the little kernel that would grow into the long-standing relationship between Peter Carl Fabergé and the Russian royal court. In a weird, roundabout way, this one ancient Scythian gold bracelet, this beautiful piece of history that may have never been found if people weren't in the right place at the right time, is almost single-handedly responsible for the prominence of the House of Fabergé. This one bracelet gave us the Fabergé egg. This one bracelet gave us a whole host of incredible items created for the Russian court. This one bracelet catapulted Peter Carl Fabergé into the echelons of greatest artists of all time. And I don't say that to discount the hard work of Gustave Fabergé founding the house, or Peter Carl going on to get his education and apprenticing and becoming a master goldsmith, but without this bracelet and his subsequent copy of the bracelet, he may have never caught the eye of Emperor Alexander III. Beautiful objects, especially beautiful expensive objects, were a dime a dozen in the Russian court. And I think this quote from Peter Carl himself actually really sums up why it is that his relationship with Alexander III was so fruitful and why he was so highly respected. He's quoted as saying, "Expensive things interest me little if the value is merely in so many diamonds or pearls." He was far more interested in creating beautiful objects that were more than the sum of their parts. Yes, of course, they were made using incredibly expensive, incredibly fine materials, but that was almost secondary. It seems to me that Peter Carl could have conjured magic out of anything. And that this attitude that something had to be beautiful not only because it was made out of beautiful materials is what made his work so compelling. And I think that's a really good spot to end this for today. Leave you with a little cliffhanger, because from here, his career skyrockets. We get one great hit after another. We get a whole retinue of beautiful little eggs, each one better than the last, and so many other gorgeous items besides those. So we will end here with the beautiful copy of an ancient Scythian lion bracelet, and we will be back on the next episode to talk about the next chapter in the House of Fabergé's history, from the exposition until 1917, when the house closed its doors. And you may be saying, wait, no, Fabergé still exists. The original House of Fabergé did close in 1917. There have been reopenings, there have been renamings, but the original house, as founded by Gustave Fabergé and taken over by Peter Carl, existed only until 1917. If you know your history, you may already have a pretty good idea of why it closed, but we'll get into that on the next episode. And that is the end of the first chapter in the history of the House of Fabergé. I have said very haughtily that I think the eggs are one of the least interesting things about the House of Fabergé. Yes, they are beautiful. Yes, I would commit mild crimes to own one of them myself. Yes, I love looking at them. But to me, that isn't what makes the House of Fabergé so interesting. What makes it so interesting is that Peter Carl was absolutely fucking obsessed with jewelry. This was his lifeblood. This was the thing that drove him, that lit the fire inside of him. He managed to take his experience, his education, and his knowledge and do exactly what he did with his beautiful jewels. He turned it into more than the sum of its parts. I really hope that you enjoyed learning about the early history of the House of Fabergé. This is the part that, to me, really sets the stage for what would come after. Yes, of course, there are many beautiful, beautiful things to come out of this that we're going to talk about in the next episode, but none of it would have been possible if we didn't get to this point. All of this travel, all of this education, all of this laying the groundwork by working for free at the Hermitage Museum. All of these things came together to create the perfect conditions to lead us to, yes, the Fabergé egg, but also the wealth of beautiful objects that were created by Peter Carl, Agathon, and the rest of the House of Fabergé that go on to live in infamy. Pieces that reside in museums around the world, still being oohed and awed at, drooled over by countless visitors every year. Pieces that still fetch tremendous prices when they come to auction. Pieces that are famous, pieces that are memorable, pieces that are exciting. The sort of work that truly earned Peter Carl Fabergé the title of King of the Goldsmiths. As you can probably tell by my tone of voice, I get so excited when someone else is so excited about their craft, and the fact that it is jewelry specific and intertwined with ancient jewelry just makes it that much more compelling to me. So join me in 2 weeks when we continue the saga of the House of Fabergé. We will pick up where we left off with Alexander III picking up that ancient Scythian bracelet replica, and we will talk about exactly how this led to the Fabergé eggs and all of the other beautiful objects besides those. If you liked what you heard, leave me a rating and review, or if you're on Spotify, you can leave me a comment. If you didn't like what you heard, don't tell me about it. I don't want to hear it. Again, if you want to watch my video series, you can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok under moonhoney.jewelry. If you want to listen to back episodes of this podcast, you can find them wherever you're listening to this now. It's on almost all podcast streaming platforms as well as YouTube. If you want to join my Patreon, you can join me at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. And if you want to see the jewelry that I make, often using ancient techniques and more often than not inspired by historical jewelry, you can find that at shopmoonhoney.com. I'm currently on a mission to create jewelry pieces with each month's birthstones as it happens. So we are in the first 2 weeks of January, and we've already got a few garnet pieces. I have an appetite for the weird and unusual varieties of stones, so if you are like me and you like the strange stuff, definitely check it out. And one last thing that I almost always forget, you can find merch at merch.shopmoonhoney.com, or it is now available in my Instagram shop. I'm going to be adding a few more tote bag designs this month. As usual, that asshole Christopher Columbus tote bag remains a fan favorite, but I'm going to be adding one that says, "The only good thing Napoleon ever did was buy Josephine all that jewelry," and one that says, "Everyone's favorite kleptomaniac tastemaker, Queen Victoria." Once again, thank you for listening, thanks for being here, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.